Imagine fighting a war that's already over, and not for a few days, but for nearly 30 years. That's exactly what Hiroo Onoda did. Sent to the Philippines during World War II, he was told never to surrender, no matter what, so he didn't. While the world moved on, men walked on the moon and Japan rebuilt. Onoda was still hiding in the jungle, surviving on coconuts, stealing rice, and ambushing patrols, convinced the war was still raging. It wasn't until 1974, when his former commander flew in personally to relieve him of duty, that Onoda finally put down his rifle. 3 decades of loyalty, survival, and unshakable belief. Hiroo Onoda wasn't just a soldier, he was a man who refused to quit, even when the war had long forgotten him. The story opens in the final days of World War II. Japan's empire is crumbling, its soldiers scattered across the Pacific. Amid the chaos, a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda receives his final orders: defend Lubang Island in the Philippines, disrupt enemy attacks, and never surrender. As Japan prepares for defeat, Onoda clings to duty, unaware that his loyalty will trap him in time. When the war ends, the world moves on, but Onoda does not. His mission becomes his prison, and his unwavering belief in his duty will define one of the most extraordinary survival stories in history. The world was burning. Cities once filled with laughter and light now lay in ashes as war devoured everything it touched. The Empire of Japan, once proud and unstoppable, was now cornered, its fleets sunk, its armies scattered across distant islands. It was 1944, and the Pacific had become a graveyard. Among the thousands of young men shaped by duty and honor, stood a determined soldier named Hiroo Onoda. He was not a man driven by ambition or fame, but by loyalty. From the moment he wore the imperial uniform, he understood that his life belonged to something far greater than himself. His country was everything, his emperor was sacred. To die for Japan was glory, but to live, for it was duty. Onoda had been trained in the shadows of defeat. He had seen the tides of war turn against Japan, yet he believed in resilience, in the unbroken spirit of the Japanese soldier. His instructors at the Nakano Intelligence School taught him that surrender was worse than death. They taught him that information was a weapon sharper than any blade, that one man's conviction could hold back an army. The lessons carved into his mind would soon become his entire existence. In the final days of the empire, when hope had already fled from the hearts of many, orders came for Onoda. He was to be deployed to a small island in the Philippines, Lubang. His mission was clear: destroy the enemy's supplies, wage guerrilla warfare, and never under any circumstance surrender. If he were captured, he must die. If he were surrounded, he must vanish into the jungle. The Emperor's war, he was told, would continue no matter what the Americans said, and men like him would be the ones to ensure that Japan would rise again. When Onoda boarded the transport plane, he looked out at the setting sun and felt no fear. The war had taken everything from so many others, but for him it had given purpose. As the engines roared, he thought of home, the mountains of Wakayama, the face of his mother who once told him to serve his nation without regret, and the countless souls who had already fallen. He vowed that he would never bring shame to their memory. The air in Lubang was heavy, thick with the scent of rain and soil. The jungle seemed alive, breathing around the soldiers who arrived with him. They were young, tired, and uncertain, but Onoda carried the weight of his mission with unshakable resolve. He met the other Japanese officers stationed there and quickly realized that morale was crumbling. Some spoke of defeat, some dreamed of home. Onoda, however, refused to listen. The war was not over until Tokyo said it was. Until he heard the Emperor's own voice, surrender was unthinkable. As the sun disappeared behind the trees and night swallowed the island, Onoda stood silently, clutching his rifle. The sound of insects and distant waves filled the air. In that moment, he made a promise to himself, a promise that would last nearly 30 years. He would not surrender. He would not abandon his post. No matter how long it took, he would fight for Japan until his final breath. The war might end for others, but not for him. For Hiroo Onoda, it had only just begun. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in the quiet coastal city of Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture. From a young age, he was taught discipline and obedience. His father, a stern and traditional man, had served in the army before him and raised his son to honor the values of loyalty and strength. The Onoda household was simple but strict, and Hiroo learned early that emotion had no place in a man's resolve. As a student, Onoda was quiet, analytical, and drawn to structure. He studied commerce but longed for something greater than numbers on paper. When he turned 18, he joined the Imperial Army, finding in it a world that mirrored his own sense of order. He excelled quickly, earning a place in the Nakano School, Japan's elite training center for intelligence and psychological warfare. There, he learned to read the terrain, understand human behavior, and survive behind enemy lines. The instructors forged their cadets into men of endurance. They taught deception, sabotage, and patience, the art of vanishing and striking unseen. Onoda absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a man absorbing truth itself. Above all, he learned one command that would define his destiny. A soldier of the Emperor never surrenders. In December 1944, the Empire sent him to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were simple but absolute: conduct guerrilla operations, disrupt enemy movements, and hold the island until reinforcements arrived. His superior officer reminded him that no matter what happened, he must never give up his mission. It was a command Onoda would carry for the rest of his life. As his transport ship neared Lubang, Onoda looked across the endless ocean and thought of home. He did not know that the world he was leaving behind would vanish within months. The cities he swore to protect would soon be in ruins, and the Emperor's voice would one day call for peace. But for Hiroo Onoda, that message would never reach the jungle. His faith in the Empire, in his orders, and in the unbroken spirit of Japan would isolate him from time itself. And on that island, with nothing but his training, his rifle, and his belief, he would fight a war that refused to end. The year was 1945, and the world was breaking apart. Japan's empire, once vast and defiant, was collapsing under the relentless weight of Allied power. In the jungles of the Philippines, Hiroo Onoda stood firm with his men, Shimada, Kozuka, and Akatsu, watching the skies tremble with distant thunder. The sounds of artillery and aircraft echoed across the horizon, like the dying heartbeat of an empire. Every soldier could feel it. The war was turning. Yet Onoda refused to believe that Japan could lose. He believed that even in the darkest hour, the Emperor would find a way to restore victory and honor to the nation. The heat in Lubang was merciless. The dense jungle wrapped around them, thick and alive with insects and the smell of decay. The small Japanese garrison had been shattered by American forces months before. Communication lines were gone, supplies were dwindling, and morale had begun to rot. Still, Onoda's resolve never wavered. He repaired his rifle, polished his sword, and repeated his orders in silence. Disrupt enemy operations, sabotage their supplies. Hold the island at any cost. Never surrender. When word reached them that American troops were advancing, panic spread among the remaining soldiers. Some considered surrender, others talked about fleeing to the mountains. Onoda gathered them and spoke with calm authority. He reminded them of their oath to the Emperor, of their duty to fight until the last breath. Many listened. Some did not. Within days, the garrison broke apart. Those who fled were captured or killed. Only a few remained loyal to the mission. Onoda, Corporal Shimada, Private First Class Kozuka, and Private Akatsu. They vanished into the jungle together, taking with them their weapons, their faith, and the belief that Japan still fought on. Then came the silence. Weeks passed without a single radio transmission. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the endless hum of the jungle. When the men ventured near the coast, they found leaflets scattered across the ground, printed in Japanese. "The war has ended," they read. "Come out and surrender." The papers were crisp, their ink fresh, but to Onoda they were lies. He studied them carefully, convinced they were part of an American trick. Why would Japan surrender while its soldiers still lived? Why would the Emperor abandon his men in the field? It was impossible. He gathered the leaflets and burned them. His men followed his lead, trusting his judgment. Onoda's confidence gave them purpose. His calm became their shield. He told them that Japan had likely regrouped elsewhere, perhaps on the mainland, preparing a massive counterattack. Their mission, he said, was to continue guerrilla warfare and await reinforcements. In the thick shadow of the jungle, their world froze in 1945. Months turned to seasons. The men hunted wild boars and monkeys, raided nearby villages for rice, and built shelters camouflaged beneath the trees. They watched the movements of Filipino patrols and studied them as if they were enemy soldiers. Every encounter confirmed their belief that the war still raged on. Onoda recorded their actions carefully, maintaining reports for a command that no longer existed. Sometimes, they found newspapers floating down the river or dropped by airplanes. They spoke of peace, of reconstruction, of Japan's surrender. But every headline only strengthened Onoda's suspicion. The Americans, he said, had perfected psychological warfare. They were trying to break their spirit, to lure them into captivity. His men nodded, their doubts buried under the weight of his certainty. Then came the broadcasts. Voices in Japanese echoed through loudspeakers, calling for the soldiers to come home. The voices mentioned names, families, even hometowns. Akatsu hesitated. He thought he recognized a voice, his own brother perhaps, but Onoda silenced him. "The enemy knows how to deceive," he said firmly. "Remember your orders. We fight until the Imperial Army returns." The words became law. No one questioned him again. The months dragged into a year. Disease crept into their bodies. The humid air turned every wound into infection. Shimada was injured during a skirmish with Filipino soldiers, his leg grazed by a bullet. Onoda tended to him with care, using leaves and ash to stop the bleeding. They hid deeper into the forest, moving with the caution of ghosts. The island became both their home and their prison. In August 1945, the sky over Japan burned with fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki fell under the atomic bomb. The emperor's voice echoed across the homeland for the first time, declaring an end to the war. But in the jungles of Lubang, no such message reached them. Their radios were silent, their isolation complete. The empire had surrendered, yet its soldiers fought on, unaware that the sun had already set on their world. When 1946 came, the jungle swallowed their tracks completely. The war had ended months ago, but for Hiroo Onoda and his men, it had only transformed. Their enemy was no longer an army of soldiers, but time itself. The Philippines entered peace, Japan began to rebuild, and the world moved forward. Yet in the humid shadows of Lubang, 4 men still lived by orders that no longer existed. They built fires at night, whispering of home, of duty, of the moment when the emperor would call them back. The sounds of airplanes overhead made them believe that reinforcements were finally coming. Each day, Onoda polished his rifle and sharpened his blade. He refused to let his spirit rust. To him, surrender was death. To surrender meant betraying everything he had been trained to uphold. The world could end, but his mission would not. And so Hiroo Onoda and his men remained, faithful to a command that time had already erased. In the eyes of the world, the war was history, but for them, hidden deep within the jungle, it was eternal. The jungle became their universe. Beneath the thick canopy of Lubang, days melted into nights, and seasons blurred into one endless cycle of survival. The sound of cicadas replaced the sound of artillery, but for Hiroo Onoda and his men, the war never ended. Their world was reduced to the rustle of leaves, the crack of distant gunfire, and the rhythm of their own breathing. Each sunrise was another day of vigilance. Each night was a test of faith. They lived like phantoms, unseen and unheard. The men built shelters woven from bamboo and palm, hidden beneath layers of foliage so thick that even the moonlight could not touch them. The jungle was both ally and enemy. It fed them, concealed them, and slowly consumed them. They learned every sound, every path, every shadow that moved through it. Onoda led patrols through the dense undergrowth, scanning for footprints, counting spent cartridges, reading the land like a book only he could understand. He treated the jungle as a battlefield, one that demanded patience instead of firepower. Food was their constant concern. They stole rice from village huts under the cover of darkness, taking only what they needed to survive. They trapped wild pigs and chickens, roasted bananas over small, smokeless fires, and gathered rainwater to drink. Each meal was a victory, each stolen grain of rice proof that they still served their emperor. The villagers called them ghosts. For the people of Lubang, the war had ended long ago, but the shadows in the forest told another story, a story of men who refused to believe that peace existed. One night, as rain poured through the canopy, Akatsu whispered that perhaps the leaflets had been true, that maybe the war really had ended. The others froze. Onoda looked at him with cold precision. If Japan had surrendered, he said, the emperor would never abandon us. We would be ordered to return. His voice was steady, without anger, only certainty. Akatsu said nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy with fear, not of Onoda, but of doubt. To question the mission was to betray everything they had endured. Months passed, and the group grew smaller. Illness and exhaustion began to take their toll. In 1949, Akatsu could bear it no longer. One morning he slipped away while the others slept, vanishing into the trees. Onoda and the others searched for him for weeks, convinced he had been captured or killed. When news later reached them that Akatsu had surrendered to the Philippine authorities, Onoda's expression hardened. To him, it was the ultimate disgrace. He told Shimada and Kazuka that Akatsu had become a traitor, a man who had surrendered not to the enemy, but to weakness. The jungle continued to shape them into something less than men and more than beasts. They repaired their uniforms with vines, patched holes with bark, and polished their rifles as if preparing for an inspection that would never come. They watched from the shadows as new soldiers, Filipino police, American scouts, patrolled the island. To Onoda, they were proof that the enemy still occupied the land. He planned small raids, striking at supply huts or destroying crops, always retreating back into the forest before dawn. Each attack renewed his belief that the Imperial Army would soon return to reclaim Lubang. Years rolled forward like a slow tide. The men grew thinner, their hair tangled and their skin hardened by sun and rain. They spoke less often, conserving energy, conserving hope. Sometimes, Onoda caught them staring into the distance with empty eyes, haunted by memories of home that no longer existed. He reminded them that homesickness was weakness. "We are soldiers," he would say. "Our families would want us to fight." His words steadied them, but deep down, even he felt the weight of time pressing against his conviction. In 1952, more leaflets fell from the sky, this time with photographs of families, mothers, and wives begging soldiers to return home. They showed smiling faces and messages written in Japanese. Shimada looked at one for a long time, his hand trembling. "It's my wife," he whispered, but Onoda refused to believe it. "The Americans know our hearts," he said. "They use them against us. They will say anything to break us." He burned the leaflet in front of them, watching the paper curl into ash. That same year, Filipino hunters stumbled upon their camp. Shots were fired, and Shimada was hit in the leg. The wound festered, and though Onoda tried to treat it, infection spread. Weeks later, Shimada died in the jungle, buried beneath a shallow grave marked only by stones. Kozuka and Onoda stood over it in silence. Onoda saluted. "He fell in battle," he said quietly. "He served the emperor with honor." In that moment, something inside both men hardened beyond repair. The years turned into decades. The island remained their enemy, and the war their only truth. They heard distant engines, saw strange boats on the shore, and convinced themselves that Japan was preparing a grand counter-offensive. Every sound of machinery, every voice on the wind became evidence that the empire would rise again. Onoda's faith became unshakable, almost sacred. He no longer needed orders. His mission had become his identity. By the early 1960s, only two men remained. Onoda and Kozuka lived like shadows of the past, hunting by day and moving by night. The villages they once raided had grown accustomed to the ghosts in the forest, and stories of their existence became legend. To the outside world, they were relics, men trapped in a war that ended long ago. But to Onoda, the jungle was still the front line. The emperor's flag still flew, invisible but eternal, in his heart. He would not surrender. not to time, not to loneliness, not even to the truth. The world could change around him, but Hiroo Onoda would remain. As long as he drew breath, the war would never end. The jungle had become his world, a living fortress of green that swallowed light and sound. Years passed, and Hiroo Onoda remained its tireless sentinel. The war, to him, was still alive. The enemy was everywhere, hidden among the trees, in the villages, even in the clouds that rumbled overhead. His companion, Kozuka, shared his vigilance. Though his eyes had grown older, his movements slower. Together, they hunted and hid, moving through the forest with the discipline of soldiers still waiting for orders. The seasons changed, but Onoda's conviction did not. He believed Japan was regrouping. He believed the emperor would one day send for him. Every day began the same way. He rose before dawn, cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and inspected their small cache of stolen supplies. Kozuka tended the fire, boiling rainwater for rice. The smell of smoke drifted through the jungle, faint but familiar. To Onoda, it was the scent of duty. They no longer spoke of home, only of strategy, patrol routes, and imagined enemy positions. They recorded their movements in a notebook made from scraps of paper, keeping careful reports for a command that no longer existed. Sometimes, they saw airplanes flying high above the island. Onoda would watch them, his heart steady, his face calm. "Reconnaissance," he would whisper. "They are preparing for the next campaign." Kozuka nodded, though his silence betrayed doubt. Both men still carried their uniforms, now patched and faded, their insignia barely visible. They took pride in maintaining them. To Onoda, wearing the uniform was an act of defiance. It was proof that the Imperial Army still lived, even if only through him. As the years unfolded, the jungle changed in subtle ways. Paths they once knew vanished under vines. Rivers shifted, trees fell, new growth rose in their place. Onoda adapted to it all, memorizing every change like a cartographer of solitude. He had grown lean and sharp, his body hardened by hunger and the relentless humidity. His mind, however, remained anchored in the war. The Emperor's words, spoken decades ago, still echoed in his thoughts. A soldier must never surrender. It was not a slogan but a commandment, one he would rather die obeying than live betraying. When Kozuka began to question the mission more openly, Onoda listened but never wavered. Kozuka wondered aloud why no reinforcements had come, why the world around them seemed so quiet. "The Americans are trying to starve us out," Onoda replied calmly. "When they lose interest, we'll strike again." Kozuka hesitated, but he nodded as he always did. Doubt was dangerous, and faith was the only currency that still held value in the jungle. One night, while moving through a nearby field, they came across a transistor radio. It was cracked and covered in dirt, but it still worked. They listened in the dark as static filled the air, followed by strange voices in Japanese. The broadcast spoke of peace treaties, technology, and a prosperous new Japan. Onoda turned the dial, searching for the military frequencies he once knew, but there was nothing. "The Americans must have forced our stations to broadcast lies," he said, turning the radio off. Kozuka said nothing, though he could not hide the look in his eyes. For a brief moment, he had recognized the sound of a new world, a world that no longer included them. Years continued to bleed together. They grew accustomed to loneliness, to silence, to the endless rhythm of rain and insects. In 1965, a group of local farmers stumbled upon their camp. Shots rang out, and the soldiers fled deeper into the mountains. It was after this encounter that Onoda began to move only at night. The daytime became a time for silence and concealment. They spoke in whispers, if at all. Despite everything, there were moments of strange peace. They watched the sun rise through the mist, listened to the call of unseen birds, and remembered the quiet mornings of their youth. Onoda often thought of his training at Nakano School, of the instructors who told him that a soldier must be a ghost, unseen, patient, immortal in spirit. Those lessons had become prophecy. He had outlasted empires, governments, and decades. By the early 1970s, the jungle had reclaimed nearly all evidence of the war, but not him. He still believed the mission was active. Kozuka had grown frail, his hair now streaked with gray, yet he remained loyal. In October 1972, the two men set fire to a stack of rice in a nearby field, convinced they were attacking enemy supplies. The villagers, terrified, alerted the authorities. Shots were fired in return, and Kozuka fell to the ground, struck by bullets. Onoda dragged him back into the trees, holding him as he bled. Kozuka's last words were barely a whisper. Maybe it really ended. Onoda stayed silent, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He buried Kozuka beneath the roots of a great tree, saluted once, and walked away. From that day on, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. The jungle was now his only companion. He hunted by moonlight, hid by day, and avoided all signs of human life. His uniform was in tatters, yet he still polished the brass buttons. His rifle, oiled and ready, remained his final link to a vanished army. He believed Kozuka had died for the Emperor, that his own duty was now doubled. Time no longer had meaning. The world outside moved through revolutions and peace, through new wars and triumphs, but Onoda was untouched by it all. He was still fighting for the Empire of Japan, still waiting for an order that would never come. To those who searched for him, he was a legend. To himself, he was a soldier, bound by honor, living proof that surrender was not in the Japanese spirit. The jungle whispered endlessly around him, but he did not listen. His mind remained clear, his purpose absolute. Each day began with the same ritual: rise, clean the rifle, patrol the perimeter. He lived not for survival, but for meaning. The war might have ended for the world, but for Hiroo Onoda, it still burned like an unextinguished flame. The forest had become his eternity. By the time Hiroo Onoda entered his third decade on Lubang Island, the world beyond had changed beyond recognition. Nations had risen and fallen, new wars had been fought and forgotten, and Japan had transformed into a place of peace and prosperity. But none of that existed for him. To Onoda, the jungle was still the battlefield, and he was still the soldier the Emperor had entrusted with an unending mission. His enemies were unseen, his orders unchanged, and his conviction unbroken. He moved like a shadow through the undergrowth, careful and silent. Every path, every stream, every hidden clearing was known to him. He no longer needed maps or compasses. The island had imprinted itself onto his mind. He could sense danger by the shift of wind or the distant call of a bird. His rifle, maintained through years of care, gleamed faintly in the dim light. Each day, he patrolled the forest, as though his commanding officer still waited for his report. He noted footprints, gathered information, and recorded observations in a notebook stitched from old scraps. His handwriting had grown smaller, more rigid, as though afraid to waste space in a world that had forgotten him. Sometimes, he saw villagers near the fields, tending crops or walking with their children. He watched them from a distance, studying their clothes and gestures. They looked different from the villagers he had once known, healthier, happier, untouched by fear. Yet in his eyes, they were still subjects of the occupying enemy. He believed that the Americans had corrupted them, turning them into informants and collaborators. When they called out into the forest, begging him to come down, he hid and listened in silence. He heard his own name shouted, carried on the wind, and he felt his heart tighten. The enemy, he thought, had learned his name. From time to time, planes still flew over the island, dropping leaflets that fluttered down like white birds. The messages were familiar. The war has been over for years. Japan is at peace. Come home. Onoda would collect them carefully, studying every line of text, comparing fonts, ink, and paper. He could find no flaw, but his conclusion was always the same. "This is clever propaganda," he murmured to himself. The enemy grows desperate. He burned the leaflets. Watching the flames consume the truth he could not accept. In the early 1970s, he found an old magazine near a stream. The cover showed men in suits, smiling, shaking hands. The text spoke of new industries, skyscrapers, and a booming economy in Tokyo. The images were vibrant, full of color and light. For a moment, his resolve trembled. Could Japan have truly rebuilt itself? Could peace exist without dishonor? But the doubt passed as quickly as it came. The enemy had mastered forgery, he thought. Their deceptions had grown more elaborate. He folded the magazine and buried it beneath the roots of a tree, as if burying a dangerous dream. Loneliness gnawed at him, but he never allowed it to weaken him. He spoke aloud to himself sometimes, addressing Kozuka as though his comrade still lived beside him. He recited military codes, orders, and poems he remembered from youth. The sound of his own voice reminded him that he was still human. The nights were long, filled with the chatter of insects and the cry of nocturnal birds. He would lie awake, gripping his rifle, dreaming of Japan. Not the one that existed now, but the one frozen in his memory. The red sun rising over the homeland, the soldiers marching in perfect order, the emperor's voice echoing in their hearts. He had no calendar, yet he sensed that many years had passed. His hair had grown gray, his hands were rough and scarred, and his uniform had become little more than threads. Yet his posture remained proud, his eyes alert. The body aged, but the spirit endured. He often thought of the emperor as an eternal figure, untouched by time. He imagined the imperial army regrouping somewhere far away, planning their great return to the Pacific. Perhaps the Americans had grown complacent. Perhaps his years of resistance were what kept Japan's spirit alive. These thoughts sustained him. In 1972, he came across a group of hunters searching the woods. They carried modern rifles, lighter and sleeker than his own. Their clothes looked strange, made of bright fabrics that did not belong to war. When they spotted him, they shouted words he could not understand. He raised his weapon and fired warning shots into the air. The men fled, leaving behind supplies, matches, canned food, and a newspaper dated decades beyond what he believed possible. He glanced at the date, his heart momentarily faltering. Then he folded the paper and placed it in his pack. "Another trick," he said softly. "They will not break me." The isolation no longer frightened him. It had become his identity. He was not lost. The world was. To him, everyone who had given up, everyone who had accepted peace, had surrendered to weakness. The war was no longer about nations or armies. It had become a battle between his faith and the world's forgetfulness. When the monsoons came, he built shelters high above the ground to escape the floods. He trapped animals, dried meat, and stored it in hollow bamboo. He carved small symbols into trees to mark his territory. He lived with the precision of a soldier, the patience of a monk, and the endurance of a man who refused to die for anything less than victory. Sometimes, when the clouds parted, he would look up at the stars and think of Japan. He wondered if the emperor still gazed upon the same sky. He wondered if his duty still mattered. But no answer ever came. Only the whisper of the jungle replied, and so he remained faithful to silence. Hiroo Onoda had become more than a soldier. He had become a legend within his own solitude, a man sustained by belief, fortified by purpose, and bound forever to a war that had ended only for those who stopped fighting. In the early months of 1974, the jungle that had been Hiroo Onoda's fortress for nearly 3 decades welcomed a stranger. The young man moved differently from the others who had come before. His steps were unsure. His voice carried no fear, only curiosity. His name was Norio Suzuki, a Japanese traveler in his 20s, who had set out into the world with a strange mission. He had told his friends before leaving Tokyo that he wanted to find 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. The world had called him eccentric, but Suzuki's heart burned with a quiet determination that mirrored Onoda's own. When Suzuki first entered the island's dense forest, he carried only a camera, some food, and a deep respect for the man he sought. The stories he had heard painted Onoda as a ghost of war, a soldier who had refused to believe in peace. Suzuki believed that if anyone could reach him, it would have to be someone who came not as an enemy, but as a fellow Japanese, a man of the same homeland. Days passed as he searched the overgrown trails, leaving small notes written in Japanese that read, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and Japan are waiting for you. I am a Japanese, too." Onoda had seen many tricks before, but something about this new intruder was different. The man spoke his language, his accent pure, his tone sincere. For several days, Onoda observed him silently from a distance, studying his movements and behavior. The man did not carry the bearing of a soldier, nor the cunning of an enemy agent. Instead, he sang softly to himself, smiled at the trees, and seemed genuinely fascinated by the island's wildlife. When he shouted Onoda's name into the forest, there was no deceit in his voice, only hope. Finally, after careful deliberation, Onoda revealed himself. When Suzuki turned and saw him, thin, bearded, and wearing the remnants of a uniform long claimed by time, his breath caught. It was as though a piece of history had stepped out from the shadows. Onoda stood tall, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes sharp and distrustful. Suzuki bowed deeply. "Lieutenant Onoda," he said in Japanese, his voice steady despite his excitement. "I am from Japan. The war is over. Everyone has been waiting for you to come home." Onoda's reply was calm but firm. "The war cannot be over. I have not received orders from my superior officer. The enemy is cunning. They will say anything to deceive us." Suzuki nodded as though expecting this. "If that is the case," he answered, "then let me bring your commanding officer here. Will you surrender your duties if he orders you to do so?" Onoda hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "If my commanding officer relieves me, I will obey." From that moment, an unlikely friendship began. Suzuki visited Onoda several times, bringing food, books, and letters from home. He listened to the older man's stories of hardship, faith, and endless vigilance. He showed him photographs of Tokyo, skyscrapers, cars, and crowds of smiling people dressed in clothes Onoda had never seen. Onoda stared at the images, silent and thoughtful, but deep inside, a storm of emotion began to stir. He felt something he had long suppressed, a yearning to believe. Each word Suzuki spoke chipped away at the wall he had built around himself. But duty still held him captive. Without official orders, he could not act. Suzuki promised to return with Onoda's superior, and the two men parted with mutual respect. True to his word, Suzuki traveled back to Japan and searched tirelessly for Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer. Taniguchi had long since left the military and was living a quiet civilian life. When he learned that Onoda was still alive, still fighting a war that had ended nearly 30 years earlier, he was struck by disbelief and guilt. He agreed to accompany Suzuki to Lubang Island to personally relieve his former subordinate. Weeks later, when Onoda saw his old commander step into the jungle, dressed not in a uniform but in civilian clothes, his heart nearly stopped. The years had aged Taniguchi, yet his voice carried the same authority that once echoed through the camps of wartime. The major stood before him and saluted. "Onoda, it is over," he said solemnly. "The Imperial Army has surrendered. Your mission is finished. You are ordered to lay down your arms." For a long moment, Onoda said nothing. The words he had waited decades to hear finally reached him, and yet they felt unreal. His body trembled, his breath unsteady. Slowly, he reached into his pack and removed his rifle, his sword, and a handful of bullets carefully preserved through the years. He presented them to Taniguchi with both hands, bowing deeply. "I have received my orders," he said quietly. "I will obey." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Onoda stood straight, his face unreadable, his eyes glistening not with defeat, but with release. For the first time in 30 years, the war was over. He had fulfilled his duty until the very last word of command. When he emerged from the jungle alongside Suzuki and Taniguchi, the sunlight struck his face, brighter than he remembered. Reporters and soldiers waited, astonished at the sight of the man who had lived by the code of a vanished world. As he walked toward them, he felt both the weight of the years and the strange lightness of freedom. Yet in his heart, the soldier within him remained, faithful, unyielding, and forever bound to the promise he had made so long ago. When Hiroo Onoda finally returned to Japan, the world he stepped into was no longer the one he had left behind. The city lights of Tokyo shimmered like distant stars, blinding in their brilliance and foreign in their order. Neon signs, automobiles, and crowded streets replaced the landscapes of memory. The Japan that once marched beneath imperial banners now bowed to the rhythm of peace, its people smiling, busy, and untouched by the scars that had shaped him. As the plane descended onto Japanese soil, Onoda's heart pounded with a mixture of awe and unease. For nearly 30 years, he had lived in a time that no longer existed, and now he was a relic brought back to life. The moment his feet touched the ground, a crowd of reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed like gunfire, and questions rained upon him in rapid bursts. "Lieutenant Onoda, how does it feel to be home? Do you regret staying on the island for so long? What kept you fighting all these years?" Onoda stood motionless, his posture still military, his uniform pressed and spotless despite its age. His answers were brief and measured. "I only did what I was ordered to do." A soldier must never surrender. His voice carried no pride, no regret, only the steady conviction of a man who had lived his life through a single code. Japan received him with both astonishment and reverence. Some hailed him as a hero, the last true warrior of the empire, a man who embodied loyalty beyond measure. Others pitied him, seeing in him the ghost of a past Japan wished to forget. The government granted him a full pardon for the actions he had taken during his long resistance, acknowledging that he had believed the war was still ongoing. Crowds gathered wherever he went, curious to see the man who had outlasted time itself. He bowed politely, but his eyes remained distant. The cheers of the people felt hollow, their energy foreign. The war had been his world, and without it, he struggled to find meaning. His family, long believing him dead, embraced him with tears and disbelief. The world had aged, yet they saw in him the same young officer who had vanished into the jungle decades ago. His younger brother was now an old man, his parents gone. The home he remembered no longer existed. Even the language felt different. Words and expressions had evolved, and he sometimes paused mid-conversation, trying to recall the Japan of his youth. Television screens played news broadcasts and entertainment shows that confused him. The young people he saw on the streets laughed freely, their clothes bright, their faces untouched by discipline or fear. He walked through the city in silence, his eyes scanning the modern skyline. The emperor he had sworn to serve was now a symbolic figure, his divine aura dissolved into the fabric of democracy. The Japan that had once lived for duty now lived for progress. Onoda felt like a ghost moving through a civilization that no longer believed in the things he had died for in spirit. He spent nights staring out the window of his small room, listening to the hum of traffic, trying to replace the whisper of the jungle that had once lulled him to sleep. The government offered him honors, interviews, and opportunities to tell his story. He accepted few. When asked what he would do now that the war was truly over, his answer was simple: "I will learn how to live again." Yet learning to live proved harder than surviving the jungle. He tried working, but modern society felt rigid in new and alien ways. The noise, the pace, the endless motion of Tokyo weighed on him. He longed for the simplicity of the forest, the rhythm of survival, the quiet certainty of purpose. In time, he decided to leave Japan. The nation he had returned to no longer reflected the one he had fought for. In 1975, he moved to Brazil, where he bought land and started a cattle ranch. There, in the open countryside, he found a measure of peace. The wide fields reminded him of the jungle, but without the constant threat of war. He worked the land with his own hands, rose with the sun, and lived by the discipline that had defined his entire life. Visitors occasionally came, journalists and admirers who wished to speak to the man who had refused to surrender. He welcomed them politely but remained private, his eyes still carrying the shadow of the soldier who had never laid down his vigilance completely. Despite the calm of Brazil, he could never fully escape the memories of Lubang. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the island, the rustle of leaves, the echo of distant gunfire, the voice of Kozuka calling through the trees. He would wake before dawn, heart pounding, reaching instinctively for the rifle that was no longer there. The war had ended, but its imprint lived within him, etched into every thought and movement. He once said, "Men should be true to their beliefs. Even if the world changes, one must not betray his heart." Those words became both his creed and his burden. Years later, he returned to Japan once more, older and gentler. The people welcomed him not as a soldier, but as a symbol, a reminder of devotion, discipline, and the tragedy of unwavering faith. He dedicated his later years to teaching young people about endurance, loyalty, and the importance of questioning blind obedience. Though he had once fought for an empire that vanished into history, He had learned to find peace within himself. As he looked upon the new generation, children who knew war only from textbooks and stories, he smiled faintly. The world had moved on, but he no longer resisted it. He had fulfilled his mission, even if the meaning of that mission had changed with time. In the quiet twilight of his life, Hiroo Onoda understood that surrender was not always defeat. Sometimes, it was simply the courage to live again. In the final years of his life, Hiroo Onoda carried the weight of his past with quiet grace. He had lived longer than the war itself, longer than the empire he had once sworn to protect. The soldier who once hid among shadows now walked peacefully beneath open skies, his heart at last unburdened. He spent his days speaking to students, teaching them not about battle or loyalty alone, but about conviction, purpose, and the danger of blind faith. He reminded them that courage must serve truth, not illusion. The jungle had tested his body, but the world had tested his soul. When he returned to Lubang Island one final time, he stood among the trees that had once been his home and his prison. The air was still, and the past seemed to breathe around him. He bowed deeply to the forest, whispering a silent farewell to the ghosts who had kept him company. The war within him had finally ended. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91, remembered not merely as the soldier who never surrendered, but as the man who proved how deeply belief can shape a life, and how peace can still bloom after decades of war.